you'd like to come a little closer, we could have a more casual conversation. Or we'll take the microphone to you.
I think after 30 odd years, some films do age, but I think the world is more powerful. And I think we have a better understanding of what it's all about. And I realized that after watching a film like this, it could be difficult to ask questions, and it could even be more difficult to have answers, but I'm open to your questions.
How could nobody said anything during that time? I don't understand.
Nobody in the case of foreign governments? No. First of all, this was a real
They were
event.
like animals in that what's the matter
That's
with
true.
those guards abusing children? Why nobody said anything?
Well, obviously, we are in a country that has more incarcerated people than anywhere in the world. And we also have a very deep racial bias in incarceration in our own country here. But that's a part. This is something that happened 32 years ago. It was based on real events. It happened in an Ankara prison, and Güney was at that prison at the time. And because he was there, this was publicized a bit, and then he novelized it as we want window panes and 2 loaves of bread. He published as a novel, and he carried this idea to France. And you realize Marin Kamitz selected this film because it's very powerful. I think, as I said, of the 200 films he's made, this is his selection. But then again, it is very difficult to make a film once you're in exile. One interesting thing that Güney insisted all his technical crew to stay in this converted abbey, which was at the time still used as a school, and many of the Turks and Kurds in exile helped build these courtyards. They did write those slogans on the walls. So in a way, it's an site-specific art project, this whole film. It is really coming from his heart, and I realize it's a very hard film, but I mean, let's stay on the topic, and let's get this question from this young man.
Actually, you answered my question. I was going to ask about where the film was made.
The film was made in a small hamlet north of Paris. And as I said, the kids were collected from Kurdish kids from Paris and Berlin. And the only actors was the guard who was fired, and then this teacher who was a revolutionary. And the girl who went to school is her daughter. And they were also exiled with Saad Kuray, a militant of a Marxist revolutionary organization. And they returned to Turkey. Now they're separated, but the little girl is now a newswoman. And recently he was jailed because of his coverage of some Kurdish issues, but then he was released now. And he still writes in these radical newspapers, I should say, about some of the injustices that she's following in Turkey. Now, the prison system is now totally separated. The juveniles are in juvenile detention centers. And also, if you remember the Midnight Express, there's even a foreigners' jail in Turkey. There was a foreigners' jail at the time. They still have. They don't mix the population together. But these are meaningless sidebars. Let's have some questions. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, what is the significance of 1981?
Okay, that's a very good question. In those periods, beginning with the 1960, the government was toppled by a military coup, and in about every 10 years there were other military coups, which I think we will not have any more military coups in Turkey, because the existing government really changed the regulation of how military is intervening in day-to-day affairs of the government. It was an arduous task, I think, but there's no danger of a military coup in Turkey compared to some other parts of the world, which we do hear all the time in Southeast Asia, Egypt recently, and that's the significance of the period.
And the film was released in 1982.
And the film was released in, 1982, and the military coup and leaders of the coup ended up writing a constitution which the government is still trying to change, but they're not being supported by the opposition parties in this effort. They tried. They met many months to no avail. They only agreed on 60 items. Yes, ma'am.
I took a tour of Turkey 2 years ago, and the tour guide was, everything looked wonderful. They were saying this was the only Muslim democracy, and it was successful. And they didn't ever bring this was all hidden. And I remember that somewhere like around 1914, what they were, building up was it Ataturk? He was
Correct.
he changed the language, and he gave the Turks their freedom from the Arabs.
He changed the alphabet.
Everything was a democracy. They never showed any. There was nothing like this. I mean, I'm really shocked to see this. And did you say they don't show this film there?
This film was banned for 17 years, but it was shown in Turkey, and since then, there are many screenings by unions and some radical parties, and events commemorating Güney's birth or death, and some other events. They do show this film. It's available.
Well, if it's a democracy today, did they suddenly vote and get rid of the military coup? Was that a
No, they did not. They did not. The last 12 years, there's a government who, as part of Turkey's accession to European Union, they changed a lot of the laws, and they changed the connection of military to the government, and they are, I can say they are defanging the military. They are separating the gendarme from the military, and they are organizing them under internal affairs and combining with the police force. These things did happen, and since then, in these segregated prisons, a couple of years ago in Pozantı, there were a lot of Kurdish kids in prison because they were rioting and throwing Molotov cocktails and stones, but basically known as kids throwing stones, and they were in these prisons, and there was another sort of kind of a riot situation, but more like a press coverage of the conditions that they're in, and that's where things are at.
No?
Yes, ma'am?
They still exist, I know.
Things do exist, of course. Humans, and that's what Güney is trying to say. It is not about the government doing this to humans, but also humans are doing it to other humans. Yes, ma'am?
How does Güney fit into the larger tradition of Turkish filmmaking?
Güney, he was born in 1937, and initially he was bicycling film reels from open-air theaters in his hometown of Adana. And then while he was in university, because of a story he wrote, he was in prison, and then he came out and became an assistant to a director, and he was writing screenplays. So initially, he was writing these screenplays. As I explained, filmmaking, there's no film industry. Each film is made as a free enterprise by raising funds from distributors or getting sponsorships. But some of the films he made, they were made for not in large cities like Istanbul or Ankara, and he had a following in other parts of the country, because people found in him a rebel, and eventually they nicknamed him as the Ugly King. He didn't have the suave manners or the looks of other leading men in Turkey at the time, and it was the heyday of the spaghetti westerns, and he got into these sort of films based on, revenge and some simple stories, and he had quite a following. And then, he made close to 110 films. And this is one of the films that he was able to take out of the country at the time, and they didn't have negatives, and they did show these films in many fundraisers in Europe in the Turkish exilic community and Kurdish exilic community, and they were really roughed up, but thanks to BFI, British Film Institute, they protected some copies. This is 16 millimeter, this is the best they have now, and his wife, Fatosh Güney, founded a foundation to find his other films and restore them, but she was not very successful in doing this. But now the Turkish Culture Ministry have some of his films in the Turkish Film Archives, and they are being restored. And if you've seen it, last year there was a program in also in New York, in Lincoln Center, and some of the other Güney films, about 8 of them, toured both Canada and United States with the support of the Culture Ministry. So they're making these films available. So that's what changed in Turkey. There's nothing to hide, and you should have access to these films, and you should be able to discuss what these films are all about.
You tell us about the circumstances under which he went to prison.
Well, I will have your question. He was in prison under many different conditions, but you must realize that he was a well-known figure, and his prison cell was almost like a film office. They would bring him the dailies, and he would see them, and he would send instructions to. He made these 3 films in proxy after making The Friend, as I said, The Herd, The Enemy, and Yo. Even producers from France and Switzerland would come and visit him in prison, discuss new projects. So he was in prison, yes, but in his last incarceration, this is still there's some rumors about whether he was innocent or not, because during an argument, a prosecutor was shot, and he was in the same restaurant, and he was recording gun sounds for post-production. Whether he did it or not is really immaterial. And after this riot in Ankara, the children's ward riot, and since he publicized, he was transferred to another prison, and from that prison he sort of escaped and finally edited his film with the help of Cactus Film in Switzerland, and it was shown in Cannes Festival. It was a co-winner of the Grand Prix with Costa Gavras' film, The Missing. Yes.
I have 2 very quick questions. My first one is, you said he made over 110 films.
He was in 110 films.
Okay, that was my question.
Yeah, exactly.
So he acted in many of those.
Many
right?
of those.
Yes, he didn't.
And then he
direct.
started making these films.
Right. Okay.
And
so I just want
you find a lot of influence from maybe Satyajit Ray and Rossellini. So he was a man not trained in cinematic arts, but he was in a search for this, and he immensely enjoyed it. He was like a folk artist in that sense.
And then my other question is, just to sort of frame the film politically, I spent a lot of time in Turkey in the 70s and 80s, and also in Kurdistan in the eastern part of Turkey. It seems like he was somewhat involved with the PKK struggle, and his identification has occurred, and I'm just wondering if you could give a little bit of background on that, and maybe also on the current situation
Sure.
in terms of liberalization of those anti-Kurdish laws, etc.
Yilmaz Güney, he was an assimilated Kurd in that sense, and some people claim that both of his parents were Kurds, but the mother was Zaza and the father wasn't, and he returned to his mother's village when he was 17 years old, and his father told him that these are your roots. So he's on a particular learning curve. And a film like The Herd, if you've seen it, he said he wanted to make it in totally Kurdish, because it was a saga of a Kurdish family taking their herd from their provincial parts of eastern Turkey to Ankara. But he said he couldn't make it, so his Kurdishness became more of an issue after he escaped from prison, and he spent his last year as an exile. But other than that, he influenced a lot of other directors, like Bahman Gobadi. He was very much influenced. And today, they look at him as a figure in Kurdish cinema. There was also a presentation of his film The Hungry Wolves in Berlinale, and when I presented it and watched it again, I did find some elements in it, like the snow, the landscape. This is trying to find an identity. I also looked at the provisional Kurdish government in northern Iraq. When they started issuing stamps, they could only be used in that area. And what do these stamps show? They show the animals, the landscape. So there's something very specific to the Kurds, whether they're in Iraq or Iran or Syria or Turkey. And they're obviously trying to find a way of filmmaking is part of their discovery. As a matter of fact, when I was in the Istanbul jury and Bahman Gobari was presenting a film, and he said, my friend, like he drives a taxi cab, and he's telling me that